And here's the thing. I want to circle back to that pitch, because the example that you just gave was so good. And I call it the going the extra mile effect, where it's not empty flattery. It's not, oh, I think you're awesome and you have such a big podcast and, you'd bring a lot of value to my listeners. No. It's going the extra mile to do that legwork and figure out, oh my gosh, you've got a book coming out in 2 months. I would love to help you promote that. That's going to make someone stop when they're reading that. They're going to go, what? You took the time to figure that out about me? Okay, let me keep reading.
Welcome to another episode of Listeners to Leads, where I'm helping podcasters launch and maintain a lead generating show. I'm your host, Alicia Galati, the CEO and head podcast strategist behind Galati Media, a full-service podcast management company. On this show, you'll hear my guests and I discuss everything it takes to launch a successful podcast and keep it running. If you're ready to get leads, land speaking gigs, and create deeper connections with your audience through your podcast, then this is the show for you. Today on the podcast, we have Courtney, and Courtney is going to share some really fun and exciting ways that you can take your podcast from a plateau of, yes, I'm getting consistent downloads, but I'm not increasing those downloads and I'm feeling really frustrated. So we talked through all of that. Then we talked about some of the strategies that you can use to ensure that your podcast is hitting those podcast charts. One of the strategies that she talks about with her audience a lot is those strategies for booking high profile guests and ways that you can not only book one guest, but multiple high profile guests. What I love so much about this conversation is that everything that Courtney talks about is from a place of giving value to your audience and making sure that your podcast is aligned with where you want your show to go and how you want to take your audience through that journey with you, either through the type of content you have, the way that you show up, or the guests that you have on your show. Please join me in welcoming Courtney to the podcast. Hello, Courtney. Thank you so much for being on the show today. I am very excited to talk all things podcasting. I mean, this is the Listeners to Leads show. Obviously, we're going to talk podcasting, but I'm excited for you to be on. So if you could start by telling everyone who you are, what you do, and about your podcast.
Yes, so Alicia, thank you for having me. I cannot wait to dig in with you because, yes, podcasting is my all-time favorite topic too. And for those that maybe have never heard of me before, who is this Courtney Elmer chick here to talk about podcasting today? I am the creator of PodLaunch. And what we do is we work with experts to help them get their podcasts in the top 100 so that they can go from that unheard expert to that in-demand thought leader in whatever niche they serve and use their voice as an agent of change in the world to create that positive, meaningful, intentional change and build their legacy.
So good. We recently had an episode where I talk about ratings, reviews. I have one planned on rankings, and that will come out right before this one. So how important do you believe rankings are in the grand scheme of things? Like when it comes to, yes, for thought leadership and to be able to say, hey, look at me, I got a top 10 or I got a top 100. Like that's really exciting. Is it the end all be all? I know the answer, but I want you to say it too.
Yes. So yeah, gosh, this is a loaded question in some sense because most people think that ratings are really important. And they are to a certain degree, but they're not important for the reason that you think they are. And so a lot of people think that ratings and reviews are like, oh gosh, okay, now I'm someone, right? It's like almost an ego play in some sense. And we'll get those people who come to us too. And they're like, look, I just want to hit 1 million downloads. I want to be in the top 10 in my category. And can you help me get there? And I'm like, actually, no, we're not a fit. We can help you get there, but you don't have the right intention behind why you want to get there. And this is really important. The charts are super important for discoverability. And that's it. It's a discoverability strategy because Alicia, you know, and for those listening, you guys know that that is one of the only avenues we have to get in front of new listeners. Unless they find you through word of mouth or hear you as a guest on another podcast, we don't have that many options. Even SEO is limited to get in front of new audiences. So the charts are the best way to do that because that's where listeners go to browse the categories they're interested in and to see what those top podcasts are and to click through of whatever interests them. If you're not on the charts, in some sense, your podcast is virtually invisible to those listeners who need you. So to me, that's why the charts are important. But yeah, while it's cool to have the bragging rights, we all know that it's a big difference between your podcast hitting the charts once versus staying on the charts. And that's ultimately what we want to achieve. Because yeah, you could break that top 100. And then if you fall off the charts and no one ever hears you again, well, what good did that really do you? So it's less about ego. It's less about credibility and authority, although that can help with your positioning, but more about how are we getting in front of the listeners who we really need to reach with our message? And the charts are one of the best avenues for that.
Makes me think of, I believe it was Alex Sanfilippo who runs PodMatch and created that. And I'm pretty sure it was at his most recent pod event or pod talks where he talked about like one of his buddies who had hit, 1 million downloads in a month and he had reached that. And he was like, I'm going to stop podcasting. And Alex was like, why? Wait, what? What are you talking about? Why are you stopping? He's like, I'm not good at it. A lot of those people who showed up and found me are probably not going to stay because I'm not into this. And I think, like you said, ranking those charts, hitting those charts, getting that kind of credibility is only one piece of the overall puzzle that is being a podcaster. If people show up to your show and you've hit those charts and you're showing up, like you said, you're not going to stay there if people aren't enjoying it and continuously pushing you into those charts.
Yes. And to that point too, if your heart is not in it, your listeners are going to feel that. There's definitely an energy exchange that happens. And, there have been times in my podcast journey where my podcast has hit a really long plateau. And the reason is, if I go back and look, it's not because I was doing anything wrong, but it was mostly because I wasn't as connected and engaged as I could have been or as I wanted to be. And that's normal. There's times we're going to go through, personal things in our life, busy seasons in our businesses, whatever that might be that causes you to not be able to show up fully in the way that you want to as a host. I never stopped podcasting during that time. The content, your show must go on, like content always went out. But there were those times where I wasn't as connected and engaged, and it was reflected in my download numbers and in the engagement that we're used to receiving from people in our community who listen.
Yeah. And it's important that we're looking at all those things, right? To understand, is the show actually working, not just for our listener, but for us too, right? It's okay to get to a point where you're like, I might need to take a break. I might need to take a step back and then come back and maybe get revitalized or re-energized. I recently had a conversation with a friend of mine who listens to my show. And she said, Alicia, I listened to your most recent episode and I really loved how your energy was. Your guest, I was like, meh, whatever. But I liked how you showed up. And I was like, oh, yeah. So that guest was not a fantastic guest. They tended to look down at their phone while I was talking. And so I had to amp up my energy to show up a certain way. And that's why I sounded super excited, because I know that comes across in the podcast. And if I'm matching that energy of the guest who's maybe looking at their phone or distracted or leaning back, then I know I'm not going to show up as my best self. And that's important to me. And I know that's important to listeners.
Yes, I have a voice coach that I work with, and her background is in working with actors, like some of the top name famous actors. And while we focus on the voice and on allowing your authentic self to be seen through your voice and through what others hear in your voice, that's one thing she's always talking to me about. She's like, because past couple of weeks, I'm like, oh, it's been an intense season in my business. I'm so tired. I don't even want to get behind the mic today. And she's like, Courtney, none of that matters. If you were acting in whatever big name movie, she said, you would have to be there and you'd have to be ready to show up. And she said, have you ever heard of something called the moment before? I was like, no, what are you talking about? She's like, well, in the acting world, this is really important. It's the moment before you go on stage. Now, the moment might be a minute. It might be 10 seconds. It might be 5 minutes. It's however much time you have to center yourself and to prepare to show up. Energy aside, calendar craziness aside, life stuff going on aside, that you have to center yourself. So I've been doing that before my interviews now. And gosh, what a difference it makes, because we bring that energy to the mic and that energy goes through the mic into the ears of our listener. And so, yeah, I have been in an intense and busy season in my business. And there probably are some episodes where that's reflected without me even being consciously aware of it. But now that I'm aware of it, this moment before is in my mind. And I'm like, okay, today for this interview, I took 3 deep breaths. I'm like, I'm here to serve. This is what I'm here to do. And I'm excited for it. Let's go. And it just got me in that right frame of mind to be able to show up and have this conversation, even here with you right now today. And I think it's a really beautiful, easy exercise that all of us can do to really put us in that right frame of mind. Because you're right, we're going to get those guests that are less than stellar. And there's going to be those days where we don't feel 100%. And we know the difference. Can your listener tell? Yeah, to some degree they can. And I think it's important for us to remember that even when we're maybe operating at 80%, we know what our 100% is, but we're only at 80 today, that we can still get closer to that simply by just really framing how we choose to show up.
You put your heart and your soul into your show. And I want to help you reach all of those potential listeners out there. That's why I'm excited to announce my upcoming podcast marketing workshop. It's about giving you practical tools to grow your audience. You'll learn the secrets to getting your podcast discovered, attracting your dream listeners, and boosting those download numbers. This workshop will be hosted live with a replay available on April 30th. You can sign up by going to galatimedia.com/workshop. Let's grow our podcasts together. I love that. When we think about maybe like you mentioned, that plateau phase of we're finding our podcast not really growing, what are some things that you work with your clients on or you recommend that people do to really take that podcast to the next level, especially when they get to that plateau phase of I've been putting in the same amount of effort, I'm not getting the same results back. What can they maybe do a little different that you've worked with your clients on?
I love this question because it's not a matter of if, but when, because we're all going to hit that plateau at some point. So when you expect it, it doesn't surprise you as much. You're not like, oh my gosh, what's happening? What's wrong with me? Am I enough of an expert? Do I need to upgrade my equipment, right? Why aren't people listening? Maybe I need to double time it on social media to share this stuff out. No, what I always say is go within first. And this is something that for many of us, especially those of us that run businesses where the podcast is a piece of what we do for marketing, the podcast is not the business itself, that your time and attention are going a lot of different places in the course of a day. And there are times in our businesses and in our lives where we hit bumps in the road, meaning we might have a season that is especially busy. At the time we're recording this, we're about to move into the 2 busiest months of the year here in the US with the holidays. Everybody knows what a blur that is and how much more demands we have on our time during this season. And there are other seasons in business like that too. Maybe it's a season where things are shifting and you're pivoting and your messaging is not fully dialed in anymore. Or maybe you're not clear on the direction that you want to go. I had a season like this about 8 months ago where it literally felt like, Alicia, I was sitting on a boat on a lake and there was fog everywhere. And I had no idea which way shore was. And I'm like, okay, I could paddle, but what good is that going to do me, right? Now I would paddle and I'm like, I have no idea if I'm going in circles, if I'm actually going in any direction, right? And there are those moments like that where we find that in our lives and in our businesses. The good thing is they're always temporary. But during those times, it can cause us to not be aware of the holes in our ability to show up, our ability to deliver, our ability to feel connected. So exactly what we're talking about with this, idea of showing up and being connected and being engaged, it translates here too when we're talking about plateaus. And this is why when we're working with clients, I'm always like, look, before we look at anything you're doing to grow the podcast, before we look at any techniques or tactical stuff that you're doing, before we even look at strategy, let's look inside. How connected are you feeling to your content right now? Do you feel like you're going through the motions? Do you feel like it's kind of heavy? Like, oh gosh, I can't miss that weekly publication. I got to hit publish, but no, I just don't have it in me to create this content, right? Where you just kind of feel like you're just throwing something together to get it out there. Those things will have an impact on your overall numbers. So it might not actually be something that you're doing or not doing that's causing that plateau in terms of your strategy, in terms of how you're sharing that content, in terms of whether your guests are sharing that content, and all these things we tend to think that it could be related to. Deeper than that, that's where we have to start. We have to look inside and say, hey, let me just be honest with myself here for a minute. Could it be possible that maybe my business has shifted and my podcast hasn't shifted with it? And then there's a disconnect there and I'm feeling that misalignment, but maybe I didn't realize it before. Or could it be that I'm getting a little bored with my podcast? That happens. There are those seasons where we kind of feel bored with the content. And what can I do then to re-energize? that content? What direction can I take this to feel excited about what I have to share? Totally transparent with you guys. I just went through a season like this with my podcast, and we had rebranded the podcast about a year ago. And I was telling myself for months after that it was the right move and I had made the right decision. And shortly after that rebrand, I had changed some things in my business and we shelved one of our offers that I'm no longer teaching. So the rebrand made sense in the context of those two offers that we were teaching and delivering at that point in time, but then that changed. What didn't change was the podcast. And I was digging in my heels like, I cannot rebrand this thing again, especially in so short a time. What are people going to think? Courtney, this podcasting expert, she's not an expert. Here she is, can't even figure out what she could do with her own podcast, you know? And I'm like, oh my gosh, it's third grade all over again when I'm on stage and all the little kids in the class are laughing at me, right? And it was that feeling and that fear and that self-doubt that really kept me stuck. Well, guess what? For that whole 8 or 9 months, we were getting consistent downloads, but not growing. And it was clear that we had reached that plateau. Now, I get a lot more downloads than most podcasts do. So comparing apples to oranges, someone might look at my show and be like, oh my gosh, I wish we had what you had. But to me, I was like, yeah, well, we're not growing. What's the deal? And it took me getting really quiet. And I literally set aside a couple days on my calendar just to dig into my podcast and sit with it and what was missing for me and what was the direction that I wanted to take this. And it became crystal clear that I needed to pivot it a little bit, to tweak it, to realign it to the work that we do in the world so that it made sense for me, both from a content perspective and to our listener. The funny thing was, as I started to share this, our listeners were like, oh yeah, we've been wondering why you've been waiting so long to do this. Totally saw that one coming, right? And I'm like, okay, so you mean I just made all that stuff up in my head about why I couldn't rebrand and all this? So I think that's the important point here, Alicia, and this is what I want you listening to really, really get, is that before we look at the strategy for growth, before we look at any kind of tactics of what we could do to drive more traffic, to break through that plateau, we got to look inside first. Once we have that clarity, then we could move to strategy. Then we could move to tactics. We have a launch and relaunch system that we teach our clients that helps them break that plateau every single time. They execute it, which is great for building momentum, building traction. But it's only going to work if you have that connection piece in place first. So that's really where we got to start.
Yeah, it really goes back to being super clear on what you're talking about, who it's for, and showing up as your 100%, right? Like you said, and being aligned with that content and being open to shifting, right? I mean, I have clients where they're like, it's been 3 months. Can we shift again? And I'm like, pause, right? So maybe it's a little quicker than what you were looking at. Give it 6 months total. And then we'll talk about rebranding. We'll talk about shifting. We'll talk about tweaking. Yes, there are little things that we can tweak and shift in the meantime, but for a full on, give it 6 months. Then you've created that consistency. Your audience is along with you. And you make sure you let them know how it's shifting and go from there. We do have some episodes where people did talk about either a little tweak or a little rebrand or big ones. We'll make sure that we link those in the show notes just as additional supplemental podcast episodes for you guys to listen to if that is something that you're considering. But I love that. I love that you had that self-awareness to take a step back, to create some space, and to really almost take yourself out of the problem, right? Because so often we are the problem and it's us holding us back. I remember at the beginning of this year, and we're in 2023 when we're recording this, where I was like, I feel like I have said everything that there is to say about podcasting. If I haven't already said it, I said it in some way. And I need a break. And so I shifted from every other week solo episodes because I was getting burnt out to once a month. And now toward the end of the year, I'm like, we're back. That's it. I'm doing more solos. I can't handle it. I got so much to say. Like, it's okay to make those shifts in your content depending on how you are able to show up to keep the podcast going and to show up well, right? Like, that's what we're talking about here, is showing up well and with integrity and to your 100%. So you mentioned charts, obviously, and one of the main ways that I'm assuming, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, that a lot of people can get on those charts is by getting those higher profile guests. And you've worked with your clients to help them do that. How do you recommend, little me anyone who is listening that's like, oh, there's no way that they could get high profile guests, in reaching out to those high profile guests. And before we dig into that, I do want to share a story. When I first launched my very first podcast back in 2018, I was thinking about doing an e-commerce podcast. You guys can't find it. It's fine. Don't go looking for it. And I wanted to have on big names. We're talking Emily, half of Being Boss, or now fully Being Boss at this point, but at the time was half of Being Boss. Molly, who is part of Being Molly. She's got a big community on Instagram, and I'd been following her for years. So people that I had been following since the beginning of my entrepreneurial journey and journey into motherhood in the online space and all that stuff. And was like, oh no, fangirl moment. If I ever were to meet them in real life, I'd lose my mind. But I want them to be on my podcast. And I had not even launched at this point. I said, you know, what's the worst that could happen? And this is something that I used to think when I wanted to ask my mom for something when I was a teenager. It was, the answer's already no before I ask. So let me go ahead and ask. And every person that I asked to be on that show said yes before I had even launched. And I think that that just speaks to people's willingness, no matter who they are, to be on someone's podcast. Most people aren't going to ask you for the downloads or the numbers or any of that stuff. Most people, especially if you go to them with a plan and clarity around what you want to talk about, are super excited to be on your show. So story time over. Hit me with all of your strategies.
Yes. You know, Alicia, this is, first of all, such a good question, because I know it's a big question in a lot of people's minds. How does so-and-so get XYZ guest on their podcast? Well, oh, that person's obviously a bigger host. Therefore, that person who appeared as a guest was probably excited, like, little old me, who's going to come on my show, you know? So I know that that thought goes through all of our minds, myself included. You know, I've had that moment many, many times in my podcast journey. And one thing that I will say, you know, with getting on the charts, and as I know you've explored with your listeners before, it's less about who you bring on the show and more about how you sell the content inside your episodes. Because we all know that to get on the charts, there's 5 things that trigger that algorithm to say, hey, this show is worth listening to. And it's hitting the follow button, downloading, listening again, rating the show, and reviewing. Those are the things that actually help Apple, and at least speaking of, you know, the Mac Daddy, no pun intended, of podcast apps, that's what lets Apple know, hey, this show is probably worth its salt. Let's share it with a few more listeners. Let's get it out there in front of people, and they'll start, you know, showing it to more people. But that aside, there's other things that we can do. And one of those is guest strategy. One caveat that I will say, a lot of people are under the misconception that, oh, if I bring these big guests on my show, well, they're going to share that episode with their 1 million followers, and then all of a sudden I'm going to be famous too. That's not going to happen. In fact, the bigger guests are less likely to share your show and their episode on your show than the smaller guests who are super excited to be on your show. Think about it this way. If you are that influencer host in someone's mind, and that you're someone's dream podcast, and they come on your podcast and they're like, oh, I'm so honored to be here, right? It's their fangirl moment. And they're like, they can't wait to share that episode, because to them, it's credibility building. Like if someone comes on my podcast, they're like, gosh darn it, I'm sharing this thing because this was my dream show to be on. And you know, here I was a guest, right? They're excited to share. On the flip side of that, someone who's bigger than me, while it might add some credibility to my name or my show to have them appear as a guest, they're less likely to share it, because sharing my show actually hurts their credibility. I'm putting hurts in air quotes, but it hurts their credibility in some sense because I'm not as big a show for them. It's not as much of a brag. Right? And human ego, it's just throughout everything that we do. This is human behavior. My background's in psychology. We do these things, right? We're human. So we have to figure out, how do we tap into the human behavior element, which on the one hand is landing the guest, which we'll talk about. But on the other hand is setting our own expectations of what that big guest is going to do for our show. It will give you credibility. It will give your show credibility. It might not bring any more downloads. So as long as we're clear on that and why that's the case, now let's look into how to actually leverage it, because you've got a podcast. You have the key that opens doors to dream collaborations that you would have never imagined. Look, a year ago, I cold pitched the vice president of customer experience at Kajabi. Now, my long game was to eventually teach a workshop for them or do some kind of collaboration or something like that. Of course, that was my end goal. But who am I, right? Like, Kajabi, they're not going to want to collaborate with me. Like on the scale of 1 to 10, 1 being like people we never want to collaborate with, and 10 being like, yes, please come teach to our people. I was probably like a 3. Okay. But what I did do was that I leveraged my podcast as the tool, as the key to get my foot in that door. So I did a little good old fashioned research. And so I was researching and I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. I started thinking about all the things I love about Kajabi, their customer service experience being one of them. Things that I genuinely love, not empty flattery, but things that I was like, wow, they do this really well. I looked up their podcast and was looking through, who they bring on as guests, that kind of thing. And I looked and I saw that the host of the podcast was actually the VP of customer experience. So my brain, I'm like, ding, ding, ding. All right. I knew that a conversation about how can we better serve our community and our clients would be really valuable for my listeners. Kajabi does that really well. The host of their podcast is someone who is the head of that department in Kajabi. Let me invite him onto the show and see if he'd be willing to be a guest. So I crafted a pitch. Now, this wasn't in the pitch. I said nothing about my podcast other than, hey, I think this could be not only a really valuable conversation for our community, but it would also put Kajabi in front of thousands of listeners. And if you don't have thousands, hundreds of listeners, right? Dozens of listeners, whatever your number is, that many listeners who are looking for a solution like yours to help their business. So I showed them why it was a win. And yeah, I have a lot of media features. I have a lot of things that I could have paraded in front of them and probably went delete, right? But because the email was so genuine and it really was from a place of wanting this guy to come share his knowledge with my community, he personally responded to that email within 24 hours and was like, I would love to be a guest. Absolutely. When can we set it up? And I brought him on the show. We had an incredible conversation. To this day, it's still one of the top performing episodes ever on our show. And that opened the door to a relationship that evolved over a span of about a year or more. I just taught a workshop for them a couple of weeks ago, and we've got some more things in the works. So it's like, that is a dream collab. The podcast was how I got it, but it was how I approached it that made the difference. So when it comes to getting big guests, here's why I always recommend starting. You don't have to cold pitch like I did, although you may eventually reach a point where you need to or where you want to because you just want that person on your show. By all means, go for it. And I just gave you some really great tips there on how to frame that pitch, make sure it's genuine, and show them why it's a win for them. But beyond that, I bet you right now, I'd be willing to bet that shows that you've appeared as a guest on have guests in their episode feed that you'd love to bring on your show. So why not reach out to that host? Reciprocity is a real thing. You've already given a lot of value to that host. Reach out and say, hey, you know what? I so enjoyed our conversation on your podcast a couple of months ago, or whenever it was. I saw that you had so-and-so on your show, and I really want to create an episode about whatever that expert's topic is for my listeners, because I think it would be valuable. Would you be willing to make an email introduction to connect me with them? They're going to say yes, because you've already given them a lot of value, right? And here's another tip, pro tip. You can even say, I'd be willing to write the email for you so that all you have to do is copy paste it and then tweak it however you want to make sure that it fits, just to save you the time. If you just be willing to hit send, boom, done. That's how I got John Lee Dumas to introduce me to Hal Elrod. I actually wrote that email for him and I said, here, tweak it however you want. And he hit send. And then Hal was like, yeah, hell yeah, I'd love to be a guest on your show, right? So that's one way. The other way is when you bring a guest onto your show, do a little stalking. Research, guys, research. Do a little research ahead of time to see who else is in their network that you might want to be connected to. This might look like going to Instagram and seeing who they follow and who follows them back. See if you can establish any kind of two-way connection to a guest that you might want to have. When James Wedmore came on my show, the only reason I got that was because I won a contest that he ran in his community. And on that contest, part of the prize was to be a guest on his show, which was like dream. That was a dream for me. But on that episode, I asked him and I said, would you be willing to come be a guest on my podcast? And I could have just as easily not asked. But like you said, Alicia, it's like, well, if you don't ask, the answer is definitely going to be no. So I was like, I'm going to shoot my shot. And he was like, yeah, absolutely. So he came on the show. And then I asked him, I'm like, look, I know you know Kate Northrup. And at the time I was really interested in talking a lot about work-life balance and that kind of stuff. So I was like, would you be willing to introduce me to Kate? and see if she might be willing to come on the show as well? He was like, yes. So look for those connections and then go into that interview with that intention at the end after you've just brought this person on to your show, given them a lot of value, and say, hey, would you be willing to connect me with whoever it is? 10 out of 10 times, I guarantee you. All right, just, to be fair, 9.9999 times out of 10. Those people are going to say yes. They're going to say yes. So this is where we start. From there are other things you can do. You can get fancy, and there's different places you can go look for guests. You can even pay guests to be on your show. I've done that. If they have a fee, a speaking fee, it's like a podcasting fee. And there are times when I knew that this particular guest or that particular guest would make a lot of sense to my audience. And again, wanted to boost the show credibility, wanted to boost the brand credibility with the intention of having this person on to be able to get more people like them to say, oh, well, if Jordan Harbinger was on your show, well, then surely this show is worth my time to be on, right? So there's that way too. But even just strictly not even delving into any of that, this is literally the best advice that I could give you, is to just start tapping into the networks of your guests and of the hosts where you're guesting. I know that was a lot.
No, I love it. I love it so much. And the strategies you're talking about are human to human connection, right? Which I think is really, really important to get back to and to draw from this, is that you're not just going in and saying, hey, I'm awesome. You're awesome. Let's make this happen. You're thinking about your audience first in what kind of content makes sense for them. You're thinking long-term credibility. You're thinking long-term connections, long-term collaborations, and how it makes sense for your podcast as value for your listener, but also as value for growing your show and creating those connections. I also think about a friend recently. She was looking for someone for like a year-end episode, and I had a client who had a really good guest on that I was like, oh yeah, this person will be perfect. Let me reach out to my client so I can make the connection. And she was like, I'm already on it. Like, she had already gone through, and like, she sent an email to this lady, was like, hey, I heard you on XYZ. I loved that you talked about this. I know you have your book coming out at this time. I want to create an episode that airs 2 months before your book comes out. I'd love to talk about da-da-da-da-da. And like, that was an easy yes for her. And she did get the guest on, right? So like, there are tons of different ways and strategies, but it goes back to creating that human connection of, all right, I like you for this reason. And I think that this would be really valuable, not only for my listener. And that shows that you're not just about touting your own clout, right? Like, you're not just about like, this is me and I'm awesome and this is my hat of awesomeness. No, you're giving value to the audience, which people are going to connect with on a deeper level. So giving that and making that super clear in that email and in that pitch, I think is where a lot of people go wrong with their pitches. And I mean, I know you do. You see a ton of terrible pitches. I see a ton of terrible pitches. And the way to stand out is not to give more of, hey, I was in top XYZ. It's to say, here is what I love about what you're doing. Here is, loving them up, buttering them up a little bit after you've researched them and giving that value, I think, is so important. So, that's so good. Any other tips or things to connect? I love pause before we get into that. I also love that you mentioned at the beginning of the higher end guests that the end goal is not usually that increase in downloads. It's that credibility, because I have seen so many clients come back and say, I had this celebrity on my show. I had this person on my show. And their episodes are doing the worst. And I had this little old person who was just really freaking excited to share, and their episode is doing so much better. Why? And to your point, like, that is the expectation. When you have those big people on, you have to set that expectation for yourself. Otherwise, you're going to be disappointed, and go into it with making sure that, yes, you're giving value to your audience, but you're also creating that potential connection and seeing where that kind of lies in your priorities, right? Like, if your priority is not to have a guest who's not going to share, or maybe have this person and maybe it's not giving as much value as this other person that's a little lesser, and I hate to use that word, but you know what I'm talking about, socially status, then maybe it's worth choosing the other person because you know that they're going to be more excited about being on the show. And it's important to consider that as well. So I love that you made that note at the beginning, because I've seen so many clients come back and say like, what happened? And I'm like, yeah, that happens.
And think about it this way too. Let's say you have Amy Porterfield on your podcast and you're like, oh my gosh, this is a win, right? You got a big podcast, or you have a business podcast. She's a big host. Like, everybody listens to her. And that is probably why that episode performs less, because guess what? Everybody already listens to Amy. Everybody who's listening to you likely already listens to Amy. So they're going to be less likely to tune in because they know who Amy is. They know what she's about. They've probably heard her talk about that topic 12 times already. And so it's going to be less of interest to them, even though that's a great credibility builder for your show to have someone like Amy on. And here's the thing. I want to circle back to that pitch, because the example that you just gave was so good. And I call it the going the extra mile effect, where it's not empty flattery. It's not, oh, I think you're awesome and you have such a big podcast and, you'd bring a lot of value to my listeners. No. It's going the extra mile to do that legwork and figure out, oh my gosh, you've got a book coming out in 2 months. I would love to help you promote that. That's going to make someone stop when they're reading that. They're going to go, what? You took the time to figure that out about me? Okay, let me keep reading. And the same is true, and I know, Alicia, you get a ton of podcast pitches for guests on your show, and not all of them are great. And there's those ones that really do stand out. And it's the extra mile effect. It's where they've taken the time and they send a screenshot and they're like, look, I really enjoyed listening to the past couple of episodes of your podcast. They named the episodes. Here's what I learned from them. In fact, I enjoyed it so much, I just went and left you a review. I don't know if you're tracking this in any way, but I hope that this helps. And they put that screenshot of the review. Even if that's their strategy for everybody that they pitch, it still gives you pause. And it still makes you go, wait a minute, they took the time to do that? Wow. Okay. Yeah. I'm going to give them the time of day and finish reading their email. Right. And we've gotten guests on the podcast that way too, simply because they went the extra mile. So yes, it takes legwork. And I know all of us want to grow quickly, but I had a conversation literally this morning with my personal trainer. And he's like, you do so many interviews. How did you get to the point where you're in demand now? Like, where people are reaching out to you, asking you to go speak at their thing or whatever. And I'm like, well, there was a time when I had to create that demand, and it was proactive. Because how do you become in demand? Well, you have to go out there and actually do the legwork. And it takes time. It takes time to pitch yourself, to position yourself. But also think of it this way. Even if you got one bigger guest on your podcast, even if you became a guest on one quote unquote bigger show, right? A show to you that's like, oh, dream collab type show. Think of what that does for your brand. Because let's just look back at the big guests example. If you get one guest, 2 guests, even 3 guests. Well, then when you reach out to that 4th guest, and maybe it's a cold pitch, you could say, I would love to put your name in the lineup alongside guests like Big Name 1, Big Name 2, Big Name 3, and others, right? And that's all that they need to know, okay, this might be worth my time because these people have taken their time to appear on this show. So maybe this is worth my time too. And I think just to bottom line all of it, to your point, Alicia, you'll never know if you don't ask. And it will always be a no if you don't ask.
Yeah, love it. This has been so incredible. Courtney, thank you so much. So much value in here. Can you let everybody know where they can find you, hang out with you, listen to your podcast? And we'll make sure that we link all of that in the show notes as well.
Yes. Okay. So my number one platform on social media is Instagram. I would love nothing more than if you took 30 seconds right now at the end of this episode and send me a DM and let me know what your biggest takeaway was from this episode. You can find me there at the Courtney Elmer. Don't be surprised when I voice message you back, right? Or ask you questions about your podcast. This is why I do this. I love creating these connections, and I would really love to know of what we talked about here today, like what resonated the most with you. So shoot me a message there. And, I teach workshops. They're totally free. There's no pitch. This is not like some kind of sales ploy or anything. My goal is just to help more podcasters succeed. I want to help you use your voice to build your legacy. Because especially as entrepreneurs, it's our responsibility to do that, right? We get to use our voices to create change. And gosh, there's so much power in that. So if you have a podcast right now that's plateaued, let's say you have not crossed that 1,000 download per episode milestone yet, and you've been podcasting for 6 months or more, or your podcast maybe hits the charts once in a blue moon, but not consistently, then I'd love to invite you, come hang out with me on one of our workshops. Insider Secrets to a Top 100 Podcast. You can go to podlaunch.info to get those details. and come hang out with me on one of those. We'll walk you through our methodology and you'll get some really valuable takeaways from that you can apply right away to your podcast. And then lastly, but not least, speaking of podcasts, come look up my podcast by the same title, Insider Secrets to a Top 100 Podcast, or just type my name, Courtney Elmer, into whatever player that you listen on. And I'd love to have you come hang out with us there too.
Ah, lovely. Again, thank you so much, Courtney. This has been so good.
Thank you, Alicia. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Listeners to Leads. If you found something in this episode valuable, I would really appreciate it if you shared it with a friend who you know would also get value from it. Want to send me a message? My favorite place to hang out is Instagram. You can find me at alicia.galati. Let me know what your favorite takeaway was from the episode. And don't forget, turning those listeners into leads is actually easy.